Hey there. Let me start with a simple question. Have you ever had a headache so bad you thought your skull might burst? Or maybe you felt pressure, not just physically, but mentally, like something inside your head was trying to claw its way out. Now imagine living in a time where there were no pills, no doctors, no science. And someone told you, we can fix this. All we need to do is make a hole in your head. Sounds insane, right? This isn't fiction. This is a very real part of human history. And tonight, I want to take you on a journey into one of the most ancient and disturbing medical practices ever recorded. It's called trepanation. And for thousands of years, across continents and cultures, people believed that cutting or scraping a hole in the human skull could heal the body or the soul. But before we dive into bone dust and ancient tools, let me properly introduce myself. This is Sleepless Doctor, where we explore the weird, forgotten, and sometimes deeply unsettling stories of medical history. From deadly cures to misunderstood minds, this channel exists for those who find comfort or curiosity in the strange roads we took to get where we are today. If you're new here, welcome. If you've ever found yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., wondering how people survived without modern medicine, you're in the right place. We post videos like this regularly, so if you genuinely enjoy these kinds of stories, the kind that make your jaw drop and your skin crawl, just a little, feel free to subscribe, but only if this truly speaks to you. Now, back to the hole. Trepanation is the oldest known surgical practice on Earth. The evidence is written in skulls, literal, physical skulls, dating back as far as 7,000 years. Archaeologists have found thousands of them. Here's the wild part. In many of those skulls, the bone shows signs of healing, which means they survived. Imagine that for a moment. A person living in the Stone Age, Bronze Age, or even in pre-Columbian South America, had part of their skull bored out using stone tools or flint. No anesthesia, no sterile rooms. And somehow, they lived to tell the tale. Even more bizarre, some skulls show multiple trepanations done over time. One French skull from the Neolithic period has 5 holes, all showing bone regrowth. So, what drove early humans to do this? There are many theories. In some cultures, it was believed that mental illness, seizures, or persistent pain were caused by evil spirits trapped in the skull. Opening the head would literally let the demons out. Others believed it would cure migraines, relieve pressure from head injuries, or restore lost consciousness. In some tribal societies, trepanation was part of a spiritual ritual, a rite of passage even. In battle-heavy cultures like the Inca, it may have been a way to save wounded soldiers with skull fractures. But no matter where it happened, from Peru to Siberia to sub-Saharan Africa, one truth kept showing up. We've always been desperate to understand what's going on inside our heads. And before Mr. E's brain scans or even basic anatomy, we used the only tools we had: rocks, bone scrapers, obsidian blades, and a terrifying amount of courage. Let me give you a picture. You're in a small mud hut. It's hot. There's chanting. You're sick. Maybe from a head injury, or maybe you've been screaming in your sleep for weeks. The healer says they know what to do. You'll lie down. They tie you up. Not out of cruelty, but to keep you from moving. And then, using a sharpened stone, they begin to scrape your skull slowly, patiently, until daylight peeks through bone. There is no anesthesia, no antibiotics, just pain and hope. And in many cases, it worked. That doesn't mean it was pleasant, or safe, or scientific. But somehow it offered relief, whether physical, spiritual, or simply the placebo of ancient trust. Some historians believe trepanation patients were thought to be touched by the gods afterward, survivors of divine surgery. In some tribes, the hole itself was covered with a carved plate made of silver, gold, or even coconut shell, a symbol of status and strength. Here's where things get even more interesting. Trepanation didn't vanish with time, it kept popping up. In medieval Europe, Islamic medicine, even Renaissance surgery textbooks. We'll cover all that later, but for now, let this sink in. The human skull is incredibly tough. It protects our most fragile organ, the brain, from impact, disease, and damage. But again and again, throughout history, humans have made the same impossible choice: to open that skull in search of healing. It's barbaric, it's brilliant, and it's deeply human. In this video, we're going to explore how trepanation evolved from ritual to science, from stone blades to surgical drills. We'll visit battlefield surgeons, ancient caves, Victorian quacks, and modern-day neuroscientists. We'll also meet people, yes, even in the 21st century, who still believe trepanation is the key to mental clarity and enlightenment. It's a story of pain and hope, of ignorance and insight, and of how medicine often walks a fine line between miracle and madness. So buckle up. The journey into the human skull is just beginning. Let me take you to a museum. It's quiet, temperature-controlled. The walls are lined with glass cases holding the remnants of lives long gone, and in one of them, there it is, human skull. But not just any skull. This one has a hole. It's not from decay, not from violence. It's but a smooth, deliberate, intentional hole, carved into the top or side like a window to the soul. At first, you might think it's a trauma wound, maybe an accident, maybe war. But then you look closer, and you see something remarkable. The edges of the bone are rounded, or smooth, as if the body tried to heal itself around the hole. That's when it hits you. This person survived. It's easy to forget that bones talk, not in words, but in scars, in texture, in density. And when archaeologists started listening, they heard stories stretching back millennia. The earliest evidence of trepanation has been found in Neolithic Europe, in parts of France, Germany, and Ukraine, dating back over 7,000 years. Skulls with holes as big as a coin, some with 1, some with 2, some with as many as 5, and these weren't done randomly. They were precise, intentional, and often remarkably clean, considering the tools available at the time. In Peru, particularly in the highlands once ruled by the Inca, the practice of trepanation became almost routine. During the height of Inca warfare, over 800 skulls have been recovered showing surgical openings. More than 2/3 of those show signs of healing. It's not just fascinating. That's impressive, because think about what they were working with. No scalpels, no antiseptic, no morphine, just sharpened obsidian. Bone tools and herbal poultices made from plants we're only beginning to understand today. One Incan skull in particular tells a haunting story. A clean circular hole sits atop the head, surrounded by perfectly rounded regrowth. Historians believe the patient may have been a soldier with a fractured skull, and this was their best shot at survival. They lived. Now compare that to Civil War rare surgery in the 1800s, where the survival rate from skull injuries was lower. Let that sink in. Some ancient societies were performing brain-adjacent surgeries better than 19th century battlefield medicine. Why? Well, part of the answer lies in something we often overlook when talking about ancient medicine. They weren't guessing. Sure, they didn't have microscopes or germ theory, but they observed, they learned, and most importantly, they passed it down. Trepanation wasn't just medical, it was cultural. Done by elders, often women, using sharp seashells or bamboo, it was a ritual for both healing and transformation. The same was true in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where spiritual leaders performed cranial openings to release evil winds from the brain. Mental illness, epilepsy, visions. They didn't have the vocabulary we use today, but they had their own way of interpreting what we now understand as neurological conditions. And somehow, their primitive techniques achieved something remarkable. They didn't kill everyone. In fact, in many regions, trepanation had a higher survival rate than you'd expect from procedures done with metal tools centuries later. Makes you wonder, were they just lucky? Or did they know something we've forgotten? What's also fascinating is that these ancient people were always doing trepanation because of illness or injury. Some skulls, especially among the Maya and other Mesoamerican groups, show signs of deliberate cranial modification with no known trauma. Could it have been status, initiation, or even a form of ancient brain enhancement? We don't know. Clearly, this wasn't just a desperate measure. In many places, it was an organized practice. Some anthropologists believe trepanation was even specialized. Certain individuals, likely considered healers or protosurgeons, developed the skills and passed them down over generations. And that's key. Because while we often look at early humans as primitive, the evidence suggests that many ancient societies had systems of medical knowledge. Observational, experimental, and trepanation was at the heart of it. They didn't always get it right, but they got it right enough to keep trying. Let's pause for a second. If you're listening to this and thinking, why would anyone let someone drill into their head with a rock? You're not alone. But remember this. When your world is filled with pain, seizures, screaming, or what might have been undiagnosed schizophrenia or PTSD, and someone offers hope, even if it involves bone and blood, you take it. Desperation doesn't wait for science. In many ways, trepanation was a bridge between myth and medicine, between superstition and science. And it didn't disappear. In fact, some of the world's most famous ancient physicians, Hippocrates, Galen, and even medieval battlefield doctors, would go on to adopt and adapt trepanation into the earliest frameworks of Western medicine. But we'll get there soon. For now, I want you to hold on to this idea. The people who came before us weren't ignorant, they were problem solvers. They were experimenters. They were human. And when we studied their skulls, with their healed holes and smooth cuts, we not just looking at ancient wounds. We're looking at ancient wisdom. So, we've walked through caves of bone and time, unearthing skulls that whispered of pain, healing, and something oddly profound. But what happened when the ritual met the rational? Let's fast forward, not too far, just a few centuries. We're now standing in the ancient Greek world, somewhere between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE, and here, the story shifts. Because this is where myth and medicine start to split. Not cleanly, never cleanly, but with a slow, intentional parting. Enter Hippocrates, the so-called father of modern medicine. He wasn't perfect. He didn't know about germs. But he did something game-changing. He wrote things down. More importantly, he challenged the gods. In his treatise on injuries of the head, Hippocrates carefully documented various cranial injuries, especially those caused in battle. He categorized skull fractures. He explained how pressure builds inside the head, and he recommended something remarkably familiar: trepanation. But now, it wasn't about evil spirits or ancestral rituals. It was about relieving pressure, draining fluid, and giving the brain, which he recognized as important, a chance to survive. Of course, even Hippocrates wasn't entirely scientific. Some of his methods were based on balance theories, the idea of humors and bodily fluids. But it was a shift. Medicine was becoming observation-based, and trepanation was no longer just a mystical practice. It was starting to be treated as a procedure, something that could be taught, replicated, improved. Later, Roman physician Galen would build on Hippocrates' work. He treated gladiators, studied anatomy through animal dissection, and came to believe that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of intelligence. That was a bold statement at the time. He also performed trepanations. But he gave them structure, surgical tools, diagrams, case studies. He brought a kind of method to the madness. Still, even in these ancient scientific societies, the shadow of ritual lingered. Because when you cut open the human skull, when you literally open a window to the mind, it's hard not to feel like you're touching something sacred. In this duality, the scientific need to heal and the emotional weight of drilling into someone's skull would never fully go away. Now, let's jump ahead again. We're now in medieval Europe. And sadly, the progress stalls. The fall of Rome, the rise of religious orthodoxy, the banning of human dissection, all of it slowed the advancement of medical knowledge. Much of what Hippocrates and Galen figured out was lost, suppressed, or twisted. But trepanation didn't disappear. Instead, it morphed. In monasteries and village huts, barber surgeons took up the practice. Yes, barbers. The same people who cut hair and trimmed beards also performed surgeries, including trepanations, with saws and chisels. And very, very little anesthesia. It was often brutal. But when someone suffered a blow to the head, a fall from a horse, a sword to the skull, this was often their only hope. Medical texts from the 13th century show diagrams of trepanation tools, some circular, some square, some with tiny hand drills. There were detailed instructions too: where to cut, how deep to go, what signs to look for to avoid fatal bleeding. They didn't always succeed. In fact, many didn't. But once again, you can see the effort, the need to solve the mystery of the brain, with nothing but hands and hope. And here's something fascinating. Despite being surrounded by superstition, many medieval doctors returned to ancient texts. They copied Galen. They preserved Hippocrates. And by doing so, they kept the flame of science flickering, just barely. Through the Dark Ages, now let's shift one more time to the Islamic Golden Age. From the 8th to the 14th century, in cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, science flourished while much of Europe struggled. Muslim physicians translated and preserved Greek and Roman texts, but they didn't stop there. They improved them. Scholars like Al-Zarawi, also known as Al-Bucasis, created surgical encyclopedias filled with instruments, techniques, and detailed case studies. He described cranial surgeries, including trepanation, with a level of precision that wouldn't be seen in Europe for another 500 years. He even warned against cutting too deep, stressing the importance of observing bone color and patient response. It was medicine, real medicine, as it was far ahead of its time. The Islamic world's contribution to trepanation is often overlooked. But without their preservation and expansion of surgical knowledge, much of what we know today might have been lost forever. So now, take a step back. Look at this arc. From tribal ritual, to Greek theory, to Roman pragmatism, to medieval chaos, to Islamic precision, trepanation survived. It evolved. And with each era, it picked up a new layer of meaning, from sacred to scientific, from guesswork to procedure. But one thing remained constant: human desire to relieve pain, to understand the brain, to save lives, even when the tools were crude and the risks were high. And in that desire, in that struggle, trepanation became something more than a hole in the head. It became a window into our deepest instincts as healers and as humans. Picture this. It's the 18th century. The Enlightenment is sweeping across Europe like wildfire. Ideas are no longer sacred. They're testable. Truth isn't whispered by priests. It's revealed by microscopes and scalpels. And in the middle of it all, the human brain, that mysterious organ once thought to hold spirits, fluids, or even God himself, becomes a battlefield for reason. Trepanation, it doesn't vanish. It evolves. This time, it's not shamans or barbers doing the drilling. It's physicians, trained, skeptical, surgical. But let's not romanticize it. This was still a world before antibiotics, before reliable anesthesia, and before sterile gloves. To open a skull in the 1700s is to dance with death. Still, doctors tried. They documented cases in journals. They held public dissections. They drew diagrams of burr holes, cranial fractures, and even patient reactions, often sketched in real time. It was messy. It was brave. And it marked the beginning of modern neurosurgery. Here's the thing, though. Surgery in this era was not just about medical innovation. It was also about performance. In bustling surgical theaters, packed with students and sometimes even curious members of the public, doctors would perform skull operations while narrating their every move. The patients, often conscious, sometimes screaming, sometimes silent, from pain or fear or both. But occasionally, the patient survived. And when they did, it was considered nothing short of miraculous. A notable figure of this time was Percival Pott, a British surgeon who documented head trauma from falls, particularly from horses. Common in the era, he recognized that sometimes the brain swelled, and that drilling carefully, just enough to relieve pressure, could save a life. No spirits, no superstition, just swelling, and hands steady enough to release it. But trepanation wasn't just about injury anymore. It began to be used for mental illness, epilepsy, and other so-called nervous disorders. And here, things get murkier again. Because now the line between science and speculation began to blur. Once more, some doctors believed that madness could be cured by releasing vapors from the brain. Others thought it was about resetting blood flow or balancing fluids. Many of these operations didn't work, and the patients who survived were often left with more trauma than before. But still, the hole remained. Not just in the skull, but in our understanding. Because even though we were learning more than ever about anatomy, physiology, and neuroscience, the truth is, the brain was still a mystery, and trepanation was one of the few keys we had. Crude, painful, dangerous, but a key nonetheless. Now, let's jump again. It's the 19th century. Anesthesia has arrived. Sterilization is taking hold. And in dusty hospitals and gleaming universities, a new generation of surgeons is starting to dream bigger. They don't want to just poke at the brain. They want to understand it. One such pioneer was Sir Victor Horsley, a British neurosurgeon who performed some of the earliest brain operations for tumors and epilepsy. He refined the use of trephines, the circular tools used to drill into the skull, and made neurosurgery a respected, systematic field. Horsley believed in precision, observation, and documentation. He mapped out brain regions, took detailed notes, and emphasized that cutting into a brain was unteed an act of desperation. It was a deliberate intervention guided by logic, and he wasn't alone. France, Germany, and the United States, surgeons were building entire departments around brain science. Trepanation, now more commonly called craniotomy or burr hole surgery, became less about guesswork and more about targeting known issues. Removing hematomas bleeding in the brain, accessing tumors, draining abscesses, even treating severe infections like tubercular meningitis. And here's what's wild. Even though the tools were better and the knowledge deeper, the fear remained. Because no matter how many degrees a surgeon had, no matter how sterile the room or sharp the blade, opening a person's skull is a moment that still carries the weight of centuries. And beneath it all, the echo of that same primal question: what happens when we peer into the mind and touch it? Now, while Europe and America were advancing, so were other parts of the world. In India, China, and parts of Africa. Traditional medicine continued to thrive, sometimes integrating Western methods, sometimes resisting them. Interestingly, in some tribal regions, like the Kisii people of Kenya, trepanation was still performed using ancient techniques well into the 20th century. And get this, modern researchers found that their success rate, based on post-op survival, was higher than many Western hospitals at the time. Why? Because they knew where to cut, how to care for wounds, and perhaps most importantly, they treated the patient with patience, ritual, and respect. It's easy to dismiss ancient medicine as primitive, but when it comes to trepanation, a practice as old as fire, sometimes the old ways had lessons we still learning today. So let's pause. We're now standing at a crossroads. The 20th century is on the horizon. X-rays are coming. CT scans are coming. Soon we'll map the brain with electricity, light, and sound. But before that, trepanation, the act of drilling a hole in your skull, is about to take one final strange turn. Turn that leads not to hospitals, but to living rooms, to artists, to spiritual seekers, to people who believe that putting a hole in your head might open the mind, not just medically, but cosmically. Not that, my friend. It's where things get weird. So far, we've explored trepanation as medicine, as trauma relief, as a surgical breakthrough. But what happens when this ancient, bloody procedure leaves the operating room and walks into your neighbor's living room? Welcome to the 1960s. It's an era of rebellion, of psychedelics. It's people searching for something more consciousness, more freedom, more meaning. In this world of flower crowns and acid trips, a strange idea began to resurface. What if trepanation wasn't just a medical act, but a spiritual one? Yes, you heard that right. There were people, educated, curious, and completely serious, who believed that drilling a hole in your skull could expand your consciousness. And leading the charge, a man named Bart Hughes, a Dutch librarian and self-proclaimed brain researcher. In 1965, Hughes published a short paper titled The Mechanism of Brain-Blood Volume (BBV), and in it, he argued that modern humans were suffering from reduced brain pulsation due to upright posture and closed skulls. His theory? That trepanation, the creation of a small hole in the skull, would allow the brain to pulsate more freely, improving blood flow and unlocking a higher state of awareness. He wasn't joking. He believed the closed skull acted like a pressure lid. Remove the lid, even partially, and the brain could breathe again. Bart called this brain-blood volume theory, and it became the foundation of a bizarre movement. But here's where things get wild. In 1965, Bart Hughes couldn't find a surgeon to trepan him, so he did it himself. Armed with a dentist's drill, a mirror, and a whole lot of determination, Hughes opened a small hole in his own forehead. He claimed that within minutes he felt lighter, freer, more connected, as if his mind had been unshackled. Naturally, the medical establishment called him insane. But to a certain group of people, he was a prophet. Enter Amanda Fielding, British aristocrat, artist, and one of the most outspoken advocates for trepanation as a form of consciousness expansion. Amanda discovered Bart's work and became obsessed with the idea. She tried to get doctors to perform the procedure. They refused. So, she did it herself too. In 1970, Amanda Fielding filmed herself drilling a hole into her skull using a dental drill. The footage, titled "Heartbeat in the Brain," is real, raw, and deeply unsettling. Blood drips down her face. She bandages herself and then calmly walks to her garden to feed the pigeons. And here's the wild part. She wasn't trying to shock the world. No. She genuinely believed this was the future of human consciousness. She later ran for British Parliament with the slogan, "Trepanation for the national health." Of course, she lost. But her activism didn't stop. She went on to found the Beckley Foundation, which still exists today, now focused on legitimate psychedelic research involving LSD, psilocybin, and brain imaging. And while Amanda eventually distanced herself from self-trepanation, her early work remains a strange chapter in the history of mind exploration. Now at this point, you're probably wondering, did it work? Did drilling a hole in the head actually improve consciousness? Or were these just desperate experiments in a desperate time? Science has not been kind to the theory. There is no solid evidence that trepanation enhances cognitive function. There is no proof that it increases brain blood volume in a meaningful or beneficial way. And performing it outside of a sterile clinical setting is incredibly dangerous. Still, people continued to try it. Throughout the 70s, 80s, and even into the 2000s, underground communities across Europe and North America carried out DIY trepanation. Some people claimed they felt more connected afterward. Others felt nothing at all, and a few ended up hospitalized. Or worse. Mainstream medicine dismissed it as pseudoscience, bordering on psychosis. But the conversation it sparked, that was real. Because beneath all the blood and controversy, trepanation had triggered a deeper question. What is consciousness? Is it purely biological, or is there something more? And if there is, how do we reach it? Bart Hughes and Amanda Fielding may not have found the answer, but they sure as hell forced the world to start asking. And in a strange twist of fate, their obsession with brain states paved the way for modern psychedelic research. In fact, many of today's leading brain scientists, like Dr. Robin Carhart Harris, have referenced Fielding's contributions not to trepanation, but to the broader field of consciousness studies. So maybe that's the legacy. Not the hole, but the hunger. The refusal to accept that what we see is all there is. The courage to explore the mind, even when the path is dark, controversial, or dangerous. But trepanation, at least the spiritual kind, slowly faded into obscurity. Public interest waned, laws tightened, and science moved on to safer, cleaner ways to study the brain. Still, the hole remains. In history, in our understanding, in the very skulls of those who believed they had found a shortcut to transcendence. Now, we're almost at the end of our journey. But before we close, we need to ask one final question. A big one. What does trepanation teach us about ourselves as a species? Not just about our medicine, but about our imagination, our fear, our desire to control what we don't understand. That's what we'll explore in our final segment. We've talked a lot about trepanation as a medical procedure, as a ritual, and even as a countercultural experiment. But what if we step back for a moment? What if we stop focusing on the drill and start looking at the whole? Because in many ways, trepanation is more than just a practice. It's a symbol, a window, into fear, into faith, into the deepest parts of who we are. Let's begin with something simple. What does a hole in the head really mean? Physically, it's trauma, a break in our most sacred casing, the skull. But psychologically, culturally, it represents vulnerability, exposure, and in some ancient cultures, even transcendence. Across the globe, the head has always been more than just a body part. It's the seat of the soul, the crown of the spirit, the most sacred place in the human form. So when you pierce that, when you open it up, you're not just performing surgery, you're crossing a line. And that line, that's where the symbolism begins. Let's rewind way back to some of the earliest known trepanation sites. In Neolithic Europe, trepan skulls weren't just signs of survival. Some of them were worn, hung on strings, placed in sacred burial mounds. Why? Because the people believed that a hole in the head could be a gateway for spirits, for energy, or even for light. In ancient Peru, some trepan skulls were buried with intricate tools and decorations. These weren't treated as victims, they were revered, seen as people who had undergone something sacred, something transformative. Even in Tibetan mysticism, there are whispers of cranial opening, not as a medical act, but as a spiritual release, allowing the soul to leave the body at the moment of death. That's the pattern, isn't it? It's this recurring idea that something must be opened for something else to be released. Call it spirit, call it pressure, call it trauma. It's the same narrative. To heal, something must break. To evolve, something must open. And trepanation, as gruesome as it sounds, fits right into that logic. It's the physical representation of a spiritual idea, that pain can lead to clarity, that wounds can become windows, that the brain, the very core of us, might just be too sealed off for its own good. Now, that's not to say every act of trepanation was symbolic. Plenty of it was purely practical. But the fact that it shows up in so many different cultures, and the fact that it keeps reappearing throughout history, suggests something deeper. Something that medicine can't fully explain. Something that science often ignores. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about modernity. Today we like to think of ourselves as rational, advanced, sterile. We build machines that simulate the brain. We scan every neuron. We reduce consciousness to circuits and synapses. And yet, we still ache. We still search. We still believe in things that can't be seen on an MRI. Why? Because at our core, we're not just brains, we're stories, we're meaning makers, we're creatures who stare into the unknown and ask, what if? Trepanation, in all its messy history, is the perfect mirror for that. It's messy, contradictory, sometimes beautiful, sometimes horrifying, just like us. Now, let me ask you something. Why do you think people still do it? Even in 2025, there are still underground forums, still YouTube videos, still individuals often completely alone who believe that drilling into their skull will liberate their mind. Are they wrong? Maybe. Probably. But are they? Crazy, that's harder to say. Because if you look closely, what they're doing isn't all that different from what mystics, monks and seekers have done for centuries. They're trying to touch something bigger than themselves. They're trying to feel something real, in a world that often feels artificial. And yes, maybe their methods are misguided, maybe even dangerous. But the desire, the longing, that's universal. We all want to feel more alive, more awake, more free. Sometimes when life is numb, when everything feels closed off, the idea of opening up the head, literally, can start to make a strange kind of sense. It's not about the hole, it's about the hope. Hope that something will change, that something new will pour in, that the fog will lift. Now, does that mean we should go around trepanning ourselves? Absolutely not. But maybe, just maybe, we can listen to what that urge is trying to tell us. Because in a world of constant noise, where we're bombarded with answers, data, distractions, the human spirit still craves open space, still craves mystery and silence, and meaning. So maybe the modern version of trepanation isn't physical at all. Maybe it's spiritual, or emotional, or artistic. Maybe it's the act of asking questions that no one else wants to ask. Maybe it's refusing to seal yourself off from pain, or wonder, or the unknown. Maybe, in the end, trepanation is a metaphor, a reminder that sometimes the only way forward is gazed through the hole, through the wound, through the crack in the surface, because that's where the light gets in. That's where the truth lives. And whether you're a Neolithic healer, a 19th century surgeon, or a barefoot dreamer in the 1960s, we're all just trying to see what's on the other side. So how did we get here? How did something that was practiced for thousands of years, cross nearly every continent, something so deeply tied to healing, ritual, and even spiritual awakening, become a historical curiosity? How did trepanation go from respected to rejected, from sacred to insane? To understand that, we need to look at the rise of something else, modern medicine. Because as much as we celebrate the breakthroughs, and we should, we also need to talk about what got left behind. Let's go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, a time when medicine was transforming fast. The microscope was revolutionizing how we understood disease. Germ theory was emerging. Anatomy was becoming more precise, more mechanical, more clinical. In that shift, it was a double-edged scalpel. On one hand, it saved lives. On the other, it started to erase anything that couldn't be measured, anything that couldn't be sterilized, categorized, or proven in a lab. Trepanation, for all its history, didn't stand a chance. Doctors started calling it barbaric. Surgeons labeled it quackery. Slowly but surely, it was scrubbed out of textbooks and out of respect, even though, ironically, some of the same principles were still being used, just under different names. Take craniotomy, for example, a modern surgical procedure where a portion of the skull is removed to relieve pressure or access the brain. Sounds familiar? It should. It's trepanation, refined and renamed. But here's the thing. In the process of refining, something else was lost. Context. In ancient times, trepanation was more than just a hole in the skull. It was part of a bigger healing story, one that saw the patient as a whole being, not just a body. It was spiritual, emotional, communal. And when medicine started chasing precision, it also began ignoring those intangibles, the human story behind the symptoms. Now, don't get me wrong, science is powerful. It's given us antibiotics, brain scans, life-saving surgeries, but it's also made medicine a little cold, a little detached, a little too confident in its own certainty. Because the truth is, we still don't fully understand the brain. We can map it, stimulate it, cut it open, but consciousness, emotion, the feeling of being alive, that's still a mystery. And mysteries don't sit well in sterile rooms, so they get ignored, dismissed, buried under data. That's exactly what happened with trepanation. It didn't fit the new model, so it was labeled outdated. It's dangerous, even delusional, and the people who still believed in it, they were branded as fanatics. Which brings us to the 20th century and a man named Bart Hughes. He was a Dutch librarian, not a doctor. And yet, in 1965, he drilled a hole in his own head, claiming it improved blood flow and enhanced consciousness. Medical professionals laughed. The press mocked him. But a small, devoted following began to emerge. People who believed that Hughes had tapped into something ancient, something real. They weren't trying to be doctors. They weren't trying to sell snake oil. They were trying to feel something. In a world that was rapidly losing its sense of wonder, and maybe that's what modern medicine still struggles with today. The idea that not everything can be explained, that not every cure comes in a bottle. That sometimes healing is messy, subjective, emotional, and deeply personal. Trepanation at its core is about release. Whether you believe it was spiritual or medical or metaphysical, it always centered on one thing: letting something out, so something else could live. Pressure, pain, darkness. The idea was simple: open up and heal. But modern systems prefer to contain, to close, to isolate.
Irony.
The irony is almost painful. Because in our attempt to eliminate primitive medicine, we may have also eliminated some of its wisdom. We stopped asking why people felt the way they did. We stopped listening to their stories. We started treating symptoms like data points, not cries for help. That's not to say trepanation should come back as standard practice. Let's be clear, self-trepanation is dangerous. There is no credible evidence that drilling a hole in your head will make you smarter, happier, or more enlightened. But dismissing it completely, pretending it never had meaning, that's just as dangerous. Because the history of trepanation doesn't just teach us about holes in skulls. It teaches us about the holes in our thinking, the blind spots in our system, the places where science, despite all its tools, still can't reach. Like pain that doesn't show up on a scan, or grief that doesn't respond to meds, or hope the irrational, burning kind that drives people to search for something more. These are the things Trepanation once tried to touch, not perfectly, not always safely, but earnestly. And if we throw all that away in our pursuit of clinical perfection, we lose something essential. We lose our humanity, because healing has never been just about fixing. It's about witnessing, holding, understanding. And sometimes that means leaving space for mystery, for meaning, for things we don't fully understand, but still need to honor. So maybe it's time to stop asking, why did people drill holes in their heads? And start asking, what were they trying to release? What were they trying to reach? And what in our modern measured world are we still trying to find? It didn't end there. You'd think that an ancient practice like trepanation, one that had been buried by centuries of scientific progress, would quietly fade into the pages of dusty medical textbooks. But it didn't. Instead, it came back. Not through hospitals or universities, but through something far more unpredictable: the underground, on the internet. Let's rewind to the late 1960s, when a man named Joey Mellon picked up where Bart Hughes left off. Mellon wasn't a doctor. He was a writer, a thinker, a rebel. And more than anything, he was curious, fascinated by Hughes' claim that trepanation could free the brain by increasing cerebral blood flow. It sounded wild. It sounded dangerous. To Mellon, it also sounded right. He wrote a book called Borehole, a brutally honest account of how he drilled a hole in his own skull with a dentist's drill. No anesthesia, no medical training, just raw conviction. It was terrifying. It was reckless. And it sparked something. Because even though the mainstream medical world dismissed Mellon as delusional, a few people began to wonder, what if there was something to it? They weren't trying to be edgy. They weren't trying to recreate ancient rituals. They were looking for something modern medicine wasn't giving them: a deeper experience of consciousness. As the 1970s and 80s rolled on, small groups of people started forming. They shared stories, techniques, theories, warnings. It wasn't just about trepanation anymore. It was about reclaiming autonomy over the mind. To these groups, the hole in the skull wasn't just literal. It was symbolic. It was a protest against a system that told them what was real, what was valid, what was safe. Then the internet happened, and everything changed. Suddenly, those scattered whispers from the underground had a platform, a place where people from around the world could meet anonymously and share what they couldn't say anywhere else. Forums began to pop up, blog posts, video diaries. Some of them were hoaxes, some were jokes, but some were very real. People uploaded photos, shared their process, talked about recovery. They weren't doctors, but they spoke with the intensity of believers, people who felt they'd touched something ancient and powerful. And that's when the media caught wind. Vice, Reddit, strange YouTube documentaries. Suddenly, trepanation was back in the spotlight, not as a medical procedure, but as a subcultural curiosity. Reporters asked the same question again and again. Why would anyone do this? The answers varied. Some believed it would increase blood flow and improve creativity. Some were chasing psychedelic experiences without drugs. Others saw it as a form of rebellion, a way to take back control from a healthcare system they no longer trusted. But all of them shared one thing: a deep dissatisfaction with the status quo. They weren't content with pills and scans and 10-minute appointments. They wanted transformation, insight, healing that felt personal, not procedural. And trepanation, in all its danger and mystery, offered that. Of course, mainstream medicine still rejected it outright. Doctors warned of infections, hemorrhaging, permanent damage, death, and they weren't wrong. Trepanation is incredibly risky when done outside a sterile, controlled environment. It's not a spiritual shortcut. It's not a DIY project. But the fact that people were still doing it, in basements, in bedrooms, in secret, says something important. It says that even in an age of robotic surgery and AI diagnostics, we're still human, still curious, still desperate to feel more, understand more, be more. Sometimes that desperation pushes us into dangerous places. That's not a defense of self-trepanation, but it is a warning. Because if people are willing to drill holes in their skulls just to feel something deeper, maybe the real question isn't what's wrong with them. Maybe the question is, what are they missing from the rest of us? From the system, from the science, from the story we tell about what it means to heal? Because trepanation isn't just a hole in the head, it's a hole in the narrative. A crack in the idea that modern medicine has all the answers. And that crack, it's growing, not because science is failing, but because it's forgetting something. Something ancient, something emotional, something human. The desire to be seen, to be heard, to be whole. And maybe, just maybe, that's what trepanation was always about. Not about escaping the body, but returning to it. It's not about rejecting science, but demanding that science remember its roots. In people, in stories, in soul. Because for every person who picks up a drill, there are thousands more quietly wondering, is there more to healing than this? That's the question trepanation leaves us with. Not whether it's real, or safe, or effective, but whether we've lost touch with a part of ourselves that still believes in mystery. By now you'd think we've moved on, that after all the centuries of bloodletting, bone drills, and mystic rituals, trepanation would finally rest in peace. But instead, it mutated. In the 21st century, trepanation didn't just survive. It adapted, reshaped by memes, half-truths, and YouTube rabbit holes. Because in an era where distrust in authority is sky-high and attention spans are razor-thin, a concept as bizarre and graphic as drilling a hole in your skull, it thrives. Let's start with pop culture. Trepanation makes appearances in horror films, sci-fi dramas, even animated series, often painted as something ancient, dangerous, and occult. A character drills a hole in their head, and suddenly they can see visions. They unlock the hidden layers of reality, become one with the universe. Of course, it's fiction. But fiction influences belief. And belief, when unchecked, can reshape behavior. Some online forums and fringe subreddits take these dramatizations literally. They treat trepanation like a mystical cheat code, a backdoor to enlightenment, spirituality, or even psychic powers. It's no longer about blood flow, or depression, or even the mind. It becomes about awakening. And here's where things get truly dangerous. Because in the hands of conspiracy theorists and pseudoscientific influencers, trepanation isn't just a weird relic anymore. It becomes a secret they don't want you to know. They'll tell you that ancient civilizations were more advanced than we are, and that trepanation was the key to their wisdom. They'll say that modern medicine suppresses this truth because it threatens the pharmaceutical industry. They'll toss around phrases like third eye activation, pineal gland decalcification, or crystalline brain harmonics. All big words, all designed to sound impressive, but none backed by actual science. Still, they sell books, they run retreats, they go viral, and the myth grows. Suddenly, trepanation isn't a brutal surgical procedure anymore. It's a spiritual brand. Some influencers claim it cured their anxiety. Others say it boosted their intelligence. A few even attribute their financial success to the clarity it gave them. And for people who are suffering, people desperate for meaning, for relief, for anything that feels real, that promise is intoxicating. They don't see risk, they see hope. And in a world where mainstream systems feel cold, overburdened, and often dismissive, the fringe starts to feel warm, welcoming, empowering. Even though it's built on nothing but speculation and spectacle, but it gets deeper. Trepanation has become a metaphor in some circles, a symbol of rejecting the establishment, of thinking for yourself, of opening your mind in a world full of sheep. It's been lumped in with flat earth theories, anti-vax rhetoric, and other forms of medical denialism. It's not always explicitly, but enough to raise alarm bells. Because once a surgical technique becomes a belief system, it becomes harder to challenge with facts. You can't just say there's no scientific proof this works. They'll say, of course not. The system doesn't want you to know. And around it goes. Meanwhile, in the real world, doctors are horrified. They're not afraid of trepanation as a procedure. It's still used in neurosurgery today for things like relieving pressure from brain bleeds or removing tumors. But they're afraid of misuse, of people attempting it at home, of influencers glamorizing it, of untrained practitioners offering cranial liberation sessions for cash. They're afraid that a practice meant to save lives is being twisted into a gimmick, a clickbait curiosity, TikTok trend, and that fear isn't unfounded. There have been cases, rare but real, of people injuring themselves while attempting to trepan without proper tools, knowledge, or medical oversight. Because in the age of the internet, the line between education and entertainment is blurry. It's blurry. One moment you're watching a historical documentary. The next, you're being served a how-to video by someone who thinks they're a prophet. That's the paradox of our time. We have more access to information than ever before, but less guidance on what to trust. So ancient practices like trepanation get caught in the middle. Are they fascinating? Absolutely. Do they have historical value, of course? Can they teach us something about the evolution of medicine and belief? Without question, and should they be revived, rebranded, and remarketed as modern self-help tools? That's where things get dangerous. Trepanation deserves to be understood, not worshipped, researched, not romanticized, most of all respected. Because whether it's performed by a surgeon in a sterile room or discussed in a Reddit thread at 2 a.m., touches on something primal. Our hunger for transformation, our yearning to break free from pain, our desire to feel alive, awake, and in control. Even if it means cutting a hole through the very bone that protects our minds. And that's the tension we'll leave this segment with. Trepanation isn't just about the past. It's about what we do with the past when we're lost in the present. When science feels out of reach, when systems feel broken, when we start to believe that the only way forward is backward. We've spent the last hour traveling through millennia. From prehistoric burial sites in Peru to elite hospitals in New York. From tribal shamans in bronze, age surgeons to Reddit theorists and TikTok mystics. All connected by one act. One small hole, carved in bone, in search of something more. But now that we're here, after everything, the science, the stories, the strangeness, you might still be wondering why. Why did they do it? Why do we still talk about it? Why does something so brutal feel oddly relatable? Well, here's a thought. Trepanation isn't really about the skull. It's about what's inside and what we wish we could change. You see, throughout history, people turned to trepanation when they felt powerless. Powerless over pain, powerless over spirits, powerless over the chaos of their own thoughts. And when the world offered no answers, no explanations, no cures, they reached for a blade. Not because they were ignorant, not because they were barbaric, but because they were desperate to heal, desperate to feel normal, desperate to make the screaming stop, whether it came from headaches, trauma, or something darker they couldn't explain. And that desperation, that's timeless, we still feel it today. It's just hidden beneath insurance paperwork, antidepressant ads, and glowing screens. We don't pick up bone chisels anymore, but we do scroll endlessly. We do jump from wellness trend to wellness trend. We do whisper to ourselves, late at night, I just want to feel better. Trepanation, in its strangest way, holds up a mirror, not to our skulls, but to our souls. It shows us how far we're willing to go when no one listens, when the pain is invisible, when science moves too slow and suffering moves too fast. It reminds us that the line between medicine and mythology is thinner than we'd like to admit, and that healing isn't just about fixing the body. It's about being seen, being believed. It's being held in a way that says what you feel is real, and it matters. And when people don't get that, they dig into their past, to ancient rituals, into their own skulls, sometimes hoping the answer is in there somewhere. But the truth is, healing doesn't come from holes. It comes from wholeness, from understanding ourselves, from not pathologizing every emotion or spiritualizing every symptom. From honoring the fact that the human experience is messy, mysterious, and often painful, and that's okay. Trepanation teaches us that pain demands a response, but not always a knife. Sometimes it just needs a conversation, space to say, hey, this hurts, without fear of being judged or dismissed. And if we learn anything from this journey, from skulls cracked in faith and fear and hope, it should be this: the body remembers, the mind tries, but the soul wants peace. And peace takes listening, it takes slowing down. It takes ditching the noise and the algorithms and the hacks and asking instead, what is this pain trying to tell me? Because maybe the pain isn't the problem. Maybe it's the message. Maybe the pressure isn't something to drill through. Maybe it's something to lean into, to feel, to face, to finally understand. And when we do that, we begin to heal in a way no blade ever could. Not through punctures, but through presence. Not through holes, but through holding space. So yeah, trepanation is bizarre. It's gruesome. It's got all the shock value the internet loves. But beneath the surface, beneath the bone, it reveals something universal. We all want to be okay. We all want to feel safe inside our own minds, and we're willing to do almost anything to get there. So maybe, just maybe, the story of trepanation isn't about drilling. Maybe it's about the depths we'll go to find ourselves. And if you've made it this far, thank you. Not just for watching, but for caring about the human condition, even when it's ugly, even when it's confusing, even when it's cracked open and bleeding and raw. This is what Sleepless Doctor is about. Uncovering the truths and the myths behind how we heal, telling stories that matter, and reminding you that you're not alone in the questions you carry. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing. Only if you truly value this kind of content. We'll be here, digging deeper, together. Until next time, take care of your mind, protect your skull. Because inside there, that's where the real magic lives.